obviously Ireland would have been completely freed. I mean, it's hilarious that the British are talking about self-determination in the 1920s at the same time that they're fighting a nationalist rebellion. This is the Illegitimate Scholar Podcast, where we think that our culture is in crisis and don't trust woke universities to explain how and why. I'm Sam, and I quit teaching history because I loved the content, but hated the limits on what and how I could teach. In this podcast, you'll hear stories in history, anthropology, culture, and geopolitics that make you rethink what you were taught in school. I changed the intro like every fucking... I still need that.
I wasn't taught anything in school, so this is great.
You weren't what?
I wasn't taught anything in school, so this is great.
I know you were. We went to high school together.
Bro, I got a philosophy degree. What the fuck do I know?
Right. You know that you know nothing.
I know nothing.
Who is that?
It's Socrates, isn't it?
I don't fucking know. I'm a Diogenes man. Okay.
That's fair.
Yeah. So yeah, today we're talking about fucking land claims. I'll explain that in a second. This is my co-host today, Ben, who's off camera because he's very ugly and he doesn't want to appear on camera.
Appreciate that.
So we're going to do things a little bit different today. I'm going to do like a solo episode, but I'm just going to bounce it off of him. And today we're going to talk about land claims. I'm going to go through how we're going to do this. We're going to talk about land claims. We're going to talk about overlapping land claims between different states, different organizations or whatever, you know, chiefdoms, insurgencies versus states. We're going to talk about the monopoly on violence. We're going to talk about international recognition of nation states. And then we're going to connect it to today, which is like, I bet you can probably guess what we're going to fucking talk about at the end. But if you can't guess, you'll see. Okay. So yeah, we're going to talk about land claims. So a land claim is like who is claiming, what entity, what group has claim over the land. Like we live in Connecticut. Our land is claimed by the U.S. federal government. It's claimed by the state of Connecticut. There's, overlapping jurisdictions between different government agencies on who is allowed to do what, but it's under the control of the United States, right? Land claims are what entity owns a certain piece of land, who has a right to be there and make laws over it, and who controls it. So one of these things that we talked about recently is like indigenous land acknowledgements. Have you heard of these before?
Vaguely.
Okay, so indigenous land acknowledgements happen. They're getting popular in like universities where when they start a meeting, they acknowledge that the land that they're on is indigenous land, and sometimes they use the word stolen and things like that. And so that is because there is a land claim by Native Americans being the ones who were originally inhabiting the land. And there's merit and there's what I'm saying is I'm not like
We're
saying
not talking about who has the right to it right now.
Right. All I'm saying is that is a thing. They're acknowledging the land, and I don't have an opinion on that, positively or negative as well. Those are an example of an overlapping land claim, right? Like The Native American tribe claims this land for a reason, but the U.S. government claims that land for a reason as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One has a slightly stronger head start right now.
Yeah, and we'll talk about why later. That's going to be a topic later on, as we're going to go through a bunch of examples of this. But when they acknowledge the land, like, oh, this is the land that belongs to them. It was stolen. That's dumb as fuck. You're just going to acknowledge that the land...
They don't go any farther, right?
What?
They don't go any farther. It's an acknowledgement that they're on their land.
It's performance nonsense. And it also, they don't even mean it, right? Because if you say that you acknowledge that the land is owned by Native Americans or it belongs to the Native Americans, then get the fuck off the land. What are you having? You're having a fucking budget meeting about the funding of a new football field at the school. Like in university, like if you're acknowledging that the land isn't yours, get the fuck off the land. And if you're going to acknowledge that the land isn't yours and belongs to someone else in your words, and then you don't get the fuck off the land, then you don't really believe that it's their land. You don't mean what you're saying.
Well, Sam, I acknowledge when I use my neighbor's car without permission that it's, they have a claim to it, but it's not going to stop me from driving it in town.
Imagine if we could do that with other things. We run up on someone's car, carjack them. You what?
I'm just using it right now. Chill.
Yeah, it's like, what do you mean, dude? I acknowledged your claim, bro.
Like, you had your turn, okay? Just wait till I'm done.
So what the fuck? It's crazy. It's fucking nonsense.
Is this like an official, like, form, or is this just like in a social or business setting they just make a acknowledgement that it's so and so's land previously. We just took it.
It's done in different ways in different places. So Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. Okay, so that one's actually that's fine, right? Like, because I think that's actually good because this land acknowledgement is acknowledging that the land is important and it's ancestral land, but not theirs anymore. Let's talk about some other overlapping land claims. We're going to start with a fan favorite, Israel-Palestine. Palestine and Israel both claim Palestine as their territory. That's going to bristle some fucking feathers. There's a point here. I said Palestine and Israel both claim Palestine as their territory. And if you heard that and you're upset about it because you're like, no, it's Israel, it's not Palestine. I'm making a point here about how the language of what we speak about is fucking important. Like, Palestine and Israel, calling it Palestine means that I'm projecting with my language that I recognize Palestine over Israel. And if you feel that Israel has the greater land claim, then you call it Israel. And, you know, Israel is obviously much more in control of the land, but yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
You say it. The language we speak is reflective of which land claim the greater culture accepts as more true. So Israel is called Israel because it's fucking, like, because America recognizes Israel broadly. I mean, most of the world does.
As a state. I mean, it's partly circumstantial because, you know, if it was two organizations, you know, you could just use those names instead. But when you have two land claims in, like, you know, in the case of, like, nation states, then it's hard to talk about one if you're just not going to use that name. Yeah.
Seriously. Ireland and the UK. 26 plus 6 equals 1. Almost fucked it up. I got a map on that wall. You see that map?
I do.
No. Okay, so it's a map of Ireland. And there's a town in the north of Ireland. The north of Ireland. You would call it Northern Ireland if you were a filthy Protestant royalist fuck. There's a town in the north of Ireland called Derry. And you see that sticky note?
I do.
The sticky note is over the word London. Because if you're a filthy Protestant imperialist fuck, you call it Londonderry. Because you recognize the rule of the foreign invaders. Now, at the same time, I should be thanking you, England, because without you, I wouldn't be an American. And I love being an American.
Fucking A, right, bud.
I'd be some filthy bog person living in an island that's now made for fucking as a tax haven. So, you know what? I'm good. You know, I love, you know, Irish descendant shit, but I'm still American. Everyone in Ireland they're the bunch of motherfuckers that weren't smart enough to leave. You know.
That is certainly a take on the situation.
Irish Americans are the people who were smart enough to get the fuck out when the get was good.
They did get out.
Yeah, okay. So I've pissed off both the Irish and the I've pissed off everybody.
We're making quick work of it today.
On those aisles. I pissed them all off right now. Okay. Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Overlapping land claims. Rhodesia's gone. Right? Yeah. Yeah, wars happen over this fucking shit. And it's inherently a problem when two groups think they deserve the land. The two groups, it's mutually exclusive. They can't both have the fucking land.
Not if they're making, you know, the same claim, which is exclusive control.
Well, if there's
messy.
Right. So if there's like a disputed region between France and Germany, the overlapping claim is that region, not the whole country.
Yeah.
You know, Israel, Palestine is, you know, a different thing. But yeah, so it's inherently a problem, and it's always going to be a problem because there's overlapping land claims, some weaker, some greater, in basically everywhere in the fucking world. And that's what I'm saying. Okay. And we're talking about insurgencies too. Okay, these could be terrorists. Like, you know, defining terrorism in itself is a problem. But they could be terrorists, like they could be the Taliban, mafias in America and Italy, cartels in Mexico, and gangs in the U.S. And in cases like this, they sometimes start acting like a state. And this is important because this understanding these different groups, the fucking mafias and the cartels and all these other things, this leads me to why ownership ultimately changes, and that is the monopoly on violence. The reason that ownership of a territory ultimately changes is because the monopoly on violence has shifted from one group to another. So there are certain places in Mexico where the cartel is essentially in control of that region. And when that is true, the cartel becomes the government in that case. And you would call it the cartel, not the government, because we recognize the legitimacy of the Mexican government, and we don't recognize the legitimacy of rule of things like cartels.
But like government, has a monopolization on force. So if there's one group in a region that's the one monopolizing force and violence, they're essentially functioning as the government. Maybe they're not doing everything.
Right.
But in terms of control, that kind of monopolization is really important.
Yeah. And over time, if it happens for an extended period of time, I mean, it's hard. It then becomes harder to argue that they're not.
Yeah, because at that point, you've legitimized over time. Whether or not people are happy about it's one thing.
Yeah.
But if that's just the normal course of business, that's your day-to-day, eventually you're not really going to balk at that.
Right. Seriously. And I mean, we saw this happen with ISIS as well. I mean, ISIS starts as a terrorist group, right? They're like launching terror attacks, but then they start controlling cities and territories and creating jails and hospitals and shit like that.
Yeah,
and schools, Islamic schools.
They had.
Right. And at that point, they start to become a real state. And like, we don't look at them legitimately yet, but then over time, the Taliban right now is essentially becoming the country of Afghanistan. I think the U.S. has like a shitload of Afghanistan's gold, and we're not giving it back because we don't recognize the Taliban as like the legitimate government. And I assume we won't give it back for a long time. I'm not saying we should, but like eventually the Taliban 20, 30 years down the road, I mean, they will be the fucking, they will be the government, and they'll have to start being recognized.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, they're the state.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm sure we'll still have plenty of other excuses lined up for not giving the gold back.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Or
that's
like,
the one we got
pretend.
right now, so we're sticking to it.
Yeah, there's some weird stuff going on with gold. That's like what happened with the Irish Republican Army, and their political wing, at least became part of the new government of the Republic of Ireland. They pushed for legitimacy enough that they became the legitimate government. They had the will of the people, which having the will of the people is essential to having the monopoly on violence, I think. The will of, even coerced will of the people. It could be coerced will of the people, but the
will of the people is what leads to them, giving their government legitimacy, and at that point, then you can exercise the right to violence freely because you've been legit. Your people are okay with you operating in that fashion.
Right. Yeah, becomes, and that's why like when places like where the government is failing, where the places where the government is unable to provide basic services, like police force, like cleaning, removing trash. The cartels and gangs in certain part of the country, they do provide like the big thing is protection. Like you always hear about mafias taking protection money. Like what they don't really mention with that, it feels like they're just shaking them down. But like just the fact that the mafia is able to collect protection money from them means that the cops are not doing their jobs. And the cops are supposed to be there providing protection for these people. But if the cops aren't doing their jobs, the mafia can come in, or a mafia, a group can come in, and they can, hustle people for money and be like, we're giving you protection money. You might call it taxes, to be honest.
I mean, yeah.
Is what it is. The difference between protection money and taxes is that the taxes are recognized by a recognized government. That's the only difference. Taxes are formalized looting of a people. Because when taxes were invented, they weren't invented to tax one's own people. They were invented to tax a conquered group of people.
Yes,
that's the original. They didn't start as taking money from your own people. It started as your country, empire, kingdom, chiefdom took over another one, and then you take a tax from those people. And the taxes weren't always, they were almost never in gold, really. They were in a raw resource that area produced, or they were oftentimes in women, unfortunately, which is, again, it's institutionalized looting. In this case, it's looting of, when countries would loot, the old laws of war were essentially, human nature is they would sexually assault women. God,
Kill, rape, pillage.
right. And that was real. That was a thing that was like they were allowed to do. If you read things written about Genghis Khan, they say when it's written literally that Genghis Khan made them his wives in like the courtyard. And what that meant is he made them his wives. He was taking ownership of them over forcing himself on them. But he's saying when they say made them his wife, I mean, that's intentional because that's how you make someone your wife. Because not only are women property, but also the conquered men and children are also property as well.
Yeah.
It's not just the women. So yeah, the women definitely had it worse, pretty much always, but it's not just the women. Yeah. So monopoly on violence. Yeah. So an example of that, the People's Republic of China. Do you know what the real name of Taiwan is?
No.
It's the Republic of China. Taiwan is not a fucking thing. Taiwan is a name that we gave to people because we weren't allowed to call them China anymore. Because the People's Republic of China, which is the country that's controlled by the Communist Party of China, the People's Republic of China wasn't recognized for decades after it had been taken over by the communists. The communists took over mainland China. The nationalists, the communists with Mao Zedong, they took over mainland China. The nationalists fled to the island of Formosa and founded the Republic of China. So Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists make the Republic of China on the island of Formosa. Mao Zedong and the communists, they take over mainland China, and it's the People's Republic of China. That's the communist one. For decades, Taiwan, as we now call it, which was just called China for a long time, even though they only controlled Formosa, they were treated as China. They had China's seat on like the UN Security Council or something like that. I
didn't know that.
Yeah. So this eventually changes in like the 70s, I think. I think it was the 70s. Like 20 to 25 years afterwards, because it became clear that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were not going to retake mainland China, and they just couldn't deny it anymore. But for a long time, the communist government was not recognized. And I mean, that's pretty par for the course. When like,
well, especially during that time.
Well, it's not just during that time, because I mean, if you go back to like the early 1800s with Napoleon, when Napoleon starts fucking going crazy and attacking everybody and taking over all of Europe, he's doing so because his ideas attacked the monarchies, basically. So the other monarchies didn't recognize his form of rule. So they formed coalitions against him, and everybody was attacking him, and he was still winning. They did the same thing with the fucking English when they chopped the king's head off in the 1600s. Charles. Other countries were really pissed. I don't know if they invaded, but eventually, like the ultimate result on that is a Dutchman on the fucking throne.
I'm sure they were thrilled about that, though, right?
Well, I mean, actually, it was a religious thing at that point. It's we can't get into it now, but it was there. It did end up with a foreigner on the throne. Well, I digress. Yeah. So they fled to Taiwan. The U.S. supports Taiwan because they were the nationalists that the U.S. was supporting to win the civil war over the communists. The communists won the civil war. Both the communists did a bunch of evil shit, especially after all this. But like, the reason that they won the civil war is because the nationalists were not great and they didn't have as much of the will of the people as the communists. I'm sure if people had seen what would eventually happen, they probably wouldn't have supported the communists.
Well,
but
I mean, hindsight.
Hindsight is 2020. Based on how it was up until that point, it makes sense to me that the Chinese people went with the communists. So what this leads me to is that the land claim a state or people support is dependent on what benefits them. You know what I mean?
I think that's probably mostly correct, because I think the cartel examples are maybe the exception to the rule there, because I don't know if it's what benefits them. I guess being alive benefits them, but it's not like they're always going by which group is going to be the most beneficial to their interests.
Well, in this case, benefit in the immediate moment could be if you don't support or at least tacitly ignore the cartel, they will hurt you, and the government is not there to protect you. So in that case, it is to your benefit to just support that government. You know what I mean?
It just feels a little wrong saying, I chose to go along with the man holding the gun to my head and call that a benefit.
It's a benefit not to get shot.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's a benefit not to get shot. But I was actually referring here to how Americans and the U.S. government, like governments and states, people as well, but mostly governments and organizations, recognize different land claims. So, for example, the United States recognizes the land claim of Israel over Palestine, right? Mm-hmm. And that is because Israel is a stronghold of American military strength in the Middle East. And people can make up all these, they can bring up all these land claim arguments, like the same land claim arguments that create the idea that Israel should have been given to Jewish people after World War II. But those land claims, that's an argument for why they have a claim over that land, and I understand that. But at the same time, when you do that, you're valuing a certain metric to decide which land claim is better over a different one, and that is inherently culturally informed. So there's no like unbiased perspective on who has a land claim over anything else. It doesn't exist.
It's going to come down to how you perceive land and ownership.
Mm-hmm. The structures of how we perceive land and ownership are created by people who benefit from maybe a certain group getting it over others. The United States internationally is going to push for the land claim of the Israelis over the Palestinians because it benefits them. Because Israel is a U.S. ally, just like it benefited the U.S. to, for as long as they possibly could, support the land claim of and the legitimacy of what is now called Taiwan as the one true China until the 1970s.
It makes sense,
Yeah.
They may not have a claim to that land themselves, but they're going to go with the one that aligns closest to their interests.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to do one more historical example on this.
All right, let's go.
World War I. You know what happened after World War I?
A lot of shit.
A lot of destruction. A lot of
repartitioning of the land.
Maps were moved.
Yeah.
Greatly, right? So, and the idea of this was this idea of self-determination, that people, that like different nations that became nation states. This is around the time that, like, a little bit after nation states become a thing. They're more like the 1800s. The idea was that the people that lived in a place would decide for themselves who ruled over them. And this is what they said they were doing, and this is what they claimed they were doing, but it's just not what happened. And it's what they'll still claim happened. You still read about this in a fucking history book. But it was the stated reason, but it wasn't real, because they broke up Austria-Hungary, and they cut off Hungarians, like a third of ethnic Hungarians with the Treaty of Trianon were put in Slovakia, Serbia, Romania, and a couple other countries where they're still treated as second-class citizens, and a lot of them have had a cultural assimilation committed on them that destroys their language and everything. Very similar stuff to what happened in Canadian, American, and Australian boarding schools with children. Forced cultural assimilation and also violence. A lot of it specifically in Serbia, but I think it's happened in all of those countries that the Hungarians became minorities in. The same happened, that was of the breakup of the Austria-Hungary. The same happened to Germans living in what became France. They were ethnic Germans. That little piece, it still belongs to France. They broke up the Ottoman Empire. A bunch of ethnic Turks were stuck under Greek rule. So a bunch of ethnicities are left out of their nation state, and they're treated as second-class citizens. It sucks. And there's a breakup of a bunch of things. And France, they argue for the self-determination, but what they really did was they weakened their political enemies, and they kept themselves strong. And Germany, the Czech Republic, a lot of it probably wanted to join Germany. At least Austria definitely did. It's hard to tell back then, but at the same time, There are situations where it's arguable that the people wanted something else, and they're very, very stark. It's clear that the people wanted something else, but for reasons other than this purported issue of self-determination, they weren't allowed to be in the country they wanted to be in. And this works the other way too, where you look at Brittany in France, where Celtic people were second-class citizens in France, and many of them would have wanted independence, likely would have had their own state in the case of a German victory that did to, or a Axis victory or whatever it's called in World War I against France, if it was done similarly to what was done to the Central Powers after World War I. And obviously Ireland would have been completely freed. I mean, it's hilarious that the British are talking about self-determination in the 1920s at the same time that they're fighting a nationalist rebellion. If you want self-determination, I mean, Ireland should have been free.
Self-determination over there is great.
Right. Self-determination where it benefits us politically.
We've already determined what we want over here, so just go away.
Yeah. So can you guess what we're going to discuss for the last part of this episode, which is about the modern issue that this is related to?
Wow, what's going on in the world right now?
Yeah, what do you think?
Is there any conflict right now?
What could possibly be going on that's related to overlapping land claims?
Well, I'm just going to assume we're going to talk about Ukraine.
Nope. We're going to talk about how the United States is going to organize an overtake of the Canadian government, because Justin Trudeau, can I say this on YouTube? Manifest Destiny was meant to include Canada. We're supposed to have that shit. Canada only exists because America lets it exist. And we're going in that motherfucker. We're taking it over. New England makes better maple syrup anyway. Punk ass Canucks. No, we're going to talk about Ukraine.
The other one sounded more fun.
Yeah, that's probably more fun. But so there's overlapping land claims, right? Like there's an overlapping land claim on Crimea and the Donbass and the other one. Okay, and there's violence on both sides. On both sides. There's violence on both sides. But no, there really is, and it's horrible. It's a fucking meat grinder. They both got conventional militaries. This isn't fighting an insurgency where 3,000 white people get killed and 1 million brown people get killed. I know that we care less when brown people get killed because they're brown. Because if we cared as much when brown people got killed as white people, or some other difference between these people, then maybe we wouldn't be bombing Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and all these other places that have been bombed by the West for the last 20 years.
Not really sounding very American here right now, Sam.
I'm sounding American as fuck. I'm going back to the Monroe Doctrine, bitch. We stay in our fucking hemisphere. We'll do some regime change limited to South and Central America. I don't want it there either, but I get it, I guess. But I don't want to be everywhere in the fucking world. Just bombing people. So the point is, there's an overlapping land claim. I can't sift through the propaganda, but it seems like a certain percentage, maybe a good amount, in the Donbass and the fucking other one want to be in Russia, and probably a certain amount of people don't want to. Same with Crimea. But we're gonna go to one of these maps from the 1920s again. You see that land up there, up at the top? Map from the 1920s? Who controls the Donbass and Crimea and more?
I'm assuming Russia.
It's Russia in the 1920s. And look, just from that, Russia had it in the 1920s. I learned that it was given from Russia to the Ukraine, basically because, or not the Ukraine, because Ukraine's a country, right, to Ukraine. This is another time when language is important. Russia gave this land to Ukraine while the Soviet Union was a thing, in order to make it easier to manage, because they didn't think the Soviet Union was going to collapse, and then it did. And then it was left under Ukraine. And like, I don't know, maybe Russia, maybe it's like it could be 100% ethnic Ukrainians, and I believe like Russian propaganda, and like it could be that Russia had taken it over and they were trying to fucking like culturally assimilate the people, and it went back to the right hands. I don't think that's true. I think there's also a lot of other propaganda on the American side. I mean, like, we know that they make propaganda, and because of all the propaganda, I can't fucking tell. But I'm not willing to say that it definitely should belong to Russia. I'm not willing to say it should definitely belong to Ukraine. But I don't like this position that people seem to be taking, which is that Russia can't have 1 inch. They have to just leave. Like, it's not fucking possible. It's not possible because, like, Putin can decide, hey, I'm going to stop the invasion, but, like, he's not the whole one in charge. Like, the oligarchs would probably kill him, and somebody else would come into power who's going to do it, because it doesn't seem like the powers that be in Russia are willing to let this go. And it's probably for a good reason. And there's the Chamberlain argument, right? That, like, oh, we're just appeasing him. But I don't know if Putin is Hitler. Because, like, Saddam Hussein, Red China, the Soviet Union, they never attacked West Germany. China never invaded Japan. Well, they never invaded Japan recently.
Yeah, talking about the state of China as we know it.
Right. Modern Japan. Like, this stuff didn't happen in a lot of cases. And are we willing to risk nuclear war for some places that no one ever fucking heard about before? Who heard the word Donbass? Most of you didn't know what Ukraine was.
I hope that's not true.
Well, bro, the American educational system has really, really started failing people in social studies. It's fucking bad. So what do you think?
Well, so with Ukraine specifically, I think from like a historical perspective, it's interesting to look at overlapping claims on territory when you have something like the fall of the Soviet Union and you have, repartitioned land prior for management. There's all these uses, and it's interesting to see and trace where the control of that area ended up going over time. That's interesting. I think when it comes to Ukraine, obviously, particularly in the West, we look at it and go, okay, well, Russia's the aggressor, right? Everything was running fine. It wasn't a will of the people thing. It was an external force invading the land with their military. So, like, that's more of a cut and dry situation in a lot of people's eyes. I'm not saying it necessarily is. I know you're going to have a counterpoint.
Yeah.
I'm just saying when you look at it that way, it's not coming across, as we were talking about earlier, as a legitimate,
right,
movement coming from that territory. It seems more like someone who owned that land fighting someone else who wants it. And obviously that kind of violence typically paints a fairly black and white picture.
Yeah, I mean, there is the point that there are, like, Ukrainian nationals who are Russian speakers.
Who might want to be under Russia's control.
Well, they were the ones fighting the war first.
Yeah.
They were fighting an insurgency there, and they were being supplied by Russia. And then they were fighting insurgency against both Ukrainian army and other militants. Ukrainian-speaking ones. So, like, it was an internal force. I mean, it would be the same thing if the Hungarians in Slovakia decided to start an armed resistance and the Hungarian government decided to jump in and help. Like, because if it is an area full of Russian people, then the Ukrainian government, if they are Russian people who consider themselves Russian people and want to be under Russia, then the Ukrainian government that's been under control of it is an occupying force.
Well, I mean, that's like, so obviously as an American, I'm going to immediately put the situation back, on our great nation. I think of the American Civil War and how, we're talking about the idea of the will of the people and self-determination in terms of where you're supposed to be. But there's no formal process for secession and contesting a state's land claim. So even if you have ethnically diverse groups or, ethnic groups within regions that you maybe prefer control of one nation over another, that's just kind of too bad in the, state building world we have right now. There is no process to challenge or appeal that decision.
Right. But that's all based in legality, not morality.
Yeah. But that's how the world works right now.
It's based in the legal system and the socially constructed arguments of the people that benefit from the status quo. Right?
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, there's obviously an organization that wants to perpetuate itself and will perpetuate itself is poised based on the culture it creates and the way it functions as a bureaucracy will perpetuate itself. Obviously, they're not going to give away for people to leave if they don't have to.
No, I mean, that's because you have to think of their place within that community.
Right. So, it doesn't...
The nation might be the community. It's going to be large, but, like, you can't let any part simply choose to exit whenever they please.
Yeah.
When everything works together. And, yeah, I mean, you might not rely on everything from, other regions outside of where you live, but like,
But that doesn't make
way
it
you're
right.
going to get out of living in a much larger community than what you're talking about. So like, how are you going to be able to choose to just exit that? Again, there is no process to it, but like, do you have that right as part of that country's community?
But at the same time, have you heard of the Russian government shelling eastern Ukraine, the Donbass? They were right. So when the Ukrainian government from like 2014 to like when the Russians invaded, they were shelling civilian populations. They were attacking military targets, but I don't know if they ever specifically targeted civilians, but apparently like 15,000 civilians were killed, and these were Ukrainian nationals who were mostly Russian speakers.
Okay.
So it's kind of like at that point, it's tricky, right? Because are they their own people then?
Really, if you're shelling them, you're really not acting like those people's government.
Yeah.
I guess ideally,
the argument is that they're housing insurgents or something like that. I assume that's the argument, because this is when the civil war is going on, and these Russian-backed militants, assuming a percentage of those were actual Russians who were going over to fight in it. But like, yeah, that was happening, and people aren't really talking about that. And like, if people say that, you get accused like, oh, you support Putin. You like, no, I don't support Putin, but I want to know what the situation is. The idea that Putin decided out of nowhere to wake up one day and just fucking march a couple million men into a fucking sovereign nation, is fucking stupid.
Yeah, I think part of it is, in this day and age, redrawing borders is pretty rare, particularly for Western, our Western audience here. That's not really something we end up doing a whole lot.
Right.
At least recently. And then at the same time, pretty much none of us were experts on the nuances of, Ukrainian-Russian land claims until about a year ago.
Right. And borders don't move because the people...
The system demands they don't.
Right. The status quo. The people basically that drew the last border change, which we'll call... borders have mostly not changed since World War II, except for the Soviet bloc in Europe. Yeah. So it's like, it benefits the people who created those borders in the first place to just say like, oh, the borders aren't going to move anymore.
Well, of course, because once you make the border and you make the state, there is, again, no process on rescinding that claim. Like, oh, well, no, now it's someone else's turn to have that. That's just how it works. Like, there is no process for, moving borders again. You don't want to at that point.
Right, but
you're not going to want the claim to change. You want it to just stick.
But just because there's no process to do it, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, right? Not, yeah. Okay, cool. I thought you were going to come all Hobbesian out on me.
No.
It's like, you motherfucker.
No,
I hope not. Yeah, I bet if I had the other Ben in here, Lawyer Ben is such a fucking neoliberal. I hope he listens to this. He probably won't, because he's a fucking neoliberal. Sitting there arguing government control and shit. What?
I am Lawyer Ben.
Oh, my bad. Jew Ben, not Lawyer Ben. This is Lawyer Ben. Lawyer Ben's here. We'll be seeing Jew Ben next week.
Jew Ben wasn't for the Israel-Palestine episode.
Fuck. Yeah. He wouldn't have liked that.
Really dropped the ball. Buddy.
Jew Ben's a Zionist, which is fine, I guess. It's not like, I don't think that's cool, but also like, is America.
I thought this was a free country.
Yeah. Me, Lawyer Ben, Jew Ben, and Rudy, all people that have appeared on the podcast. We're going to a Theo Von show next week. Gang, baby. Hell yeah.
Do we have our own gang land we're controlling now?
Yeah. Our gang lands.
We got a land claim finally?
We have a land claim. We do. It's swamp Yankeedom, and we carved out a little part. No, we ain't got shit.
It's the nicest swamp you've seen. Okay, we made sure to pick the best of the best.
Yeah, we're going to see fucking Theo Von.
Turn that into an episode.
Fucking might record it on the way.
Nah.
Do a roadcast. Unfit Statesman did a fucking roadcast. He recorded it in the fucking car while his producer, whoever the fuck Sean is, was driving. He was in New Jersey. He just ended up like talking shit about people he saw for about 10 minutes.
I mean, sounds about right for Jersey,
In
right?
Jersey, yeah. Yeah. Cool. You got anything else? You got any fucking closing thoughts?
No, not really.
Free Palestine! That's my closing thoughts.
I thought it might be.
Oh yeah, brother.